For decades, Venezuela was more than just an oil producer. It was a symbol of what abundant natural resources could mean for a country's prosperity. In the mid-20th century, its GDP per capita rivaled some wealthy Western nations. But today, Venezuela's economy stands as one of the most dramatic modern failures in the Western Hemisphere. And the lessons it offers are not just historical curiosities, they're cautionary signals for any country that relies on narrow economic foundations, mismanages monetary policy, or overlooks institutional decay. This is not a story of ideology, it is a story of economics, governance, and how systems break when incentives and institutions fail. Venezuela's experience shows a nation with immense wealth, the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, estimated at around 300 billion barrels, yet minimal productive capacity and collapsing output. That paradox holds real lessons for the U.S. and others watching global economic risk unfold. At first glance, Venezuela's wealth in oil seems like an economic jackpot. But the collapse teaches a fundamental truth. Natural resources do not automatically generate sustained prosperity. Nations that depend excessively on a single commodity risk falling into what economists call the resource curse, where resource wealth crowds out other productive sectors and exposes the economy to volatile price swings. Venezuela's oil revenues once funded expansive social programs and government spending, but they also masked underlying economic fragilities. When oil prices plunged in 2014, the government faced a severe revenue collapse it could not absorb because it had not diversified its economic base. For the U.S., which still relies on oil and gas as part of its energy and industrial mix, the lesson is clear. Diversification matters. A healthy economy distributes risk across multiple sectors: technology, services, manufacturing, agriculture, exports, so that the fall in one area does not destabilize the whole. Venezuela did not achieve that balance. Venezuela's collapse was not triggered solely by external shocks. The government's economic decisions made downturns far worse. Policies such as rigid price and currency controls, subsidy programs without sustainable funding, and massive state intervention in production systems distorted basic economic signals. Instead of adjusting policies when oil prices fell, the government doubled down on intervention, worsening inefficiencies and shrinking productive capacity. The result was a vicious cycle. Output fell, shortages increased, and foreign exchange reserves dwindled. The government resorted to printing money to finance deficits, which unleashed hyperinflation, eroding real incomes and savings. Venezuela's hyperinflation, at times measured in the millions of percent, destroyed the value of wages and savings and collapsed domestic consumption. The U.S. lesson here is not about copying Venezuela's policies, but about recognizing how monetary and fiscal missteps can magnify a downturn into systemic collapse. Policy credibility matters. When monetary authorities lose control of inflation expectations, confidence evaporates, investments stall, and recessions deepen. A stable economic system requires confidence in money, contracts, and institutions. Venezuela's extreme dependence on oil revenues, with little diversification into manufacturing, technology, or services, made the economy fragile. When oil exports contracted, there were few alternative engines of growth. Even basic imports for food, medicine, and industrial inputs became scarce. The United States is more diversified than Venezuela, but it is not immune to sector risk. Economic growth that depends too heavily on financial markets or consumption without productivity gains risks stalling, and when critical sectors suffer shocks, the ripple effects can spread far beyond the original industry. A broader lesson for the U.S., especially as its economy ages demographically, is the importance of boosting productivity across sectors, fostering innovation, and avoiding systemic reliance on any single revenue or production source. One of the most important lessons from Venezuela is that institutions determine whether resources do good or harm. During periods of high oil prices, Venezuela could have invested in education, infrastructure, entrepreneurship, or industrial diversification. Instead, successive governments used revenues to expand the state, finance subsidies, and co-opt political support. Institutions grew weak, accountability eroded, and corruption spread. When institutions weaken, courts, regulatory bodies, central banks, economic policy becomes arbitrary. Confidence collapses, investment retreats, and markets fragment. Venezuela's withdrawal from international financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank in the mid-2000s removed external checks and technical support, isolating its economy from global stability mechanisms. For the U.S., whose institutional strength has been a key pillar of economic resilience, the lesson is stark. Protect the rule of law, independent institutions, and transparent economic frameworks. Without those, even wealthier nations can face instability. Venezuela's collapse was not just an economic downturn, it was a multidimensional breakdown involving politics, society, and governance. Economic contraction intertwined with political polarization, mass migration, and social fragmentation. Millions fled the country, creating one of the largest displacement crises in the world, rivaling conflicts in the Middle East. This shows that economic policy is not isolated from broader societal health. Unchecked inflation, collapsing services, and institutional breakdown affect health outcomes, education, migration, and social cohesion. A purely economic collapse becomes a humanitarian one. For the U.S., which faces challenges in demographic shifts, labor force participation, and income inequality, Venezuela's experience is a reminder. Economic policy cannot be divorced from social outcomes. Stable, inclusive growth requires institutions that serve both markets and people. Throughout the Venezuelan crisis, external pressure, notably sanctions, were part of the strategy many governments used to apply leverage. Sanctions targeted government officials, institutions, and economic sectors. But sanctions alone were not enough to reverse the underlying collapse. They slowed revenue flows and applied pressure, but did not fix mismanagement, institutional decay, or structural imbalances. In some cases, they encouraged informal markets or circumvention rather than structural reform. The broader lesson for the U.S., whether in applying sanctions against foreign regimes or debating protectionist measures domestically, is that economic pressure by itself is not sufficient without credible pathways to reform and stability. Coercive tools must be paired with strategies that address underlying institutional and structural issues. Perhaps the most visceral lesson from Venezuela is the destructive power of hyperinflation. When prices rise uncontrollably, money loses its role as a store of value or unit of account. Savings vanish. Contracts break down. People are forced into barter or foreign currency. Hyperinflation in Venezuela reached catastrophic levels, reducing real wages to fractions of their former value and pushing millions into poverty. For the U.S., where inflation is always a central concern of households and retirees, Venezuela's experience is a cautionary benchmark. High, uncontrolled inflation destroys confidence in currency, savings, and institutions. Even moderate inflation, if persistent, chips away at purchasing power and long-term planning. Venezuela's collapse shows that no economy, no matter how rich in resources, is immune to collapse when governance, policy, and institutions fail. Proximity to markets, wealth of resources, and strategic location were not enough to prevent decay. What matters more is how policy shapes incentives, how institutions uphold rules, and how economic signals are respected. For the United States, a much more diversified and institutionalized economy, the lesson is not that collapse is imminent, but that resilience is not automatic. It must be safeguarded through sound policy, fiscal discipline, institutional integrity, and strategic foresight. Venezuela teaches that economic collapse rarely comes from a single cause. It is a confluence of policy mistakes, overdependence on one sector, distorted monetary decisions, weak institutions, and social fragmentation. Its story is a cautionary tale for any nation that takes stability for granted. The U.S. does not face the same vulnerabilities as Venezuela, but it does face demographic shifts, fiscal pressures, inflation risks, and political polarization. Venezuela's experience is not a distant drama. It is a mirror reflecting how economic systems can fail when fundamentals are ignored. The central lesson is timeless and universal. Economic health depends not on wealth alone, but on responsible policy, robust institutions, and diversified, productive foundations.